This session is first in the course and covers the STEPS Centre's Pathways approach, which we'll be discussing in all the other sessions, but this gives an overview. So where does this start? It starts with trying to think about what are the framings of sustainability challenges as faced today. And very often sustainability is talked about in terms of rapid, accelerating changes, interacting crises, needing urgent response, often presented as doomsday scenarios, often even apocalyptical, requiring urgency and emergencies, even on war footings. Sustainability challenges are also thought about in terms of presenting a view from global Earth system sciences, as we'll discuss in other sessions around planetary boundaries, tipping points, creating what some have called a safe space for humanity. And sustainability, of course, as framed in these ways, is increasingly prominent and a wider policy concern. We've got the Sustainable Development Goals, we've got the Paris Climate Agreement, and we've got public pressure from climate strikes, from Extinction Rebellion, from high-profile media coverage, from BBC films by David Attenborough onwards. Sustainability is very much at the fore. But the STEPS Centre doesn't necessarily frame it in this way, in this conventional way, because we find sometimes that this is not always helpful. Because actually, very often these conventional framings ignore much of the socio and political context. Who is affected by climate disasters or pandemics? What are the racial, gender, locational dimensions of sustainability? These are the sort of questions of political ecology and a political economy around thinking about sustainability as a politically and socially constructed phenomenon in a highly unequal world. And a variety of the initiatives of the STEPS Centre over the years, most recently, perhaps, for example, the Pollen Natures Year in 2020, where we hosted the pollen conference and discussed human, non-human interactions and natures for a year, the questions of transformation, a discussion we've had continuously over many years, and the opportunities as discussed in the Emancipatory Rural Politics Initiative for more internationalist collective responses to the closing down of opportunities for sustainability and challenging unequal social dynamics. So we see sustainability much more in this broader sense. And this is what the summer school courses and this online course are all about. And so this is the context within which we've asked a big question over the last 15 years as part of the STEPS Centre's work. How can pathways to sustainability that link technology, environmental integrity with social justice be conceptualized and built in the complex of a dynamic, and I perhaps add unequal, world? So the STEPS Centre's Pathways approach has evolved over time and continues to evolve as different people have contributed to it, both inside the centre and beyond. It started off particularly as a conversation between science and technology studies and science policy and development studies, reflecting the joining together of the core hosts at Sussex University, SPRU and IDS. And that came together in the Dynamic Sustainabilities book, which sort of set out our store about 10 years ago. Central to this, as I mentioned, was this constructivist perspective on knowledge and framing of problems and solutions, which is then combined with a political economy and a political ecology perspective on interests, on the power of incumbency, and how change happens in policy and more broadly within social action. And our concern with in the STEPS Centre from the beginning has been to link these conceptual understandings, which challenge in many ways that mainstream perspective on sustainability, to practical concerns. So the manifesto developed the so-called 3D agenda, which you can hear about in some other sessions on this course, linking direction and distribution and diversity and thinking about the connections between innovation, sustainability, and development, and thinking about how negotiations happen across diverse sustainabilities. So our aim has always been to focus on real problems in real places through collaborative research now over 15 years. Especially through the core collaborations of the SEP Center hubs. And since 2006, when we set off on this journey, there's been a wide debate and lots of comparisons of the pathways approach with other approaches to sustainability and resilience and so on. And we find this debate really helpful. But I want to share with you what we think about the pathways approach and how it can be a flexible, heuristic way of thinking that challenges some of the mainstream perspectives on sustainability and development that dominate. And we've even produced a nice little animation that encapsulates all of this, all within 4 minutes. So during the rest of this course, and during the discussions that we have as a result, please engage with these ideas, challenge them, push them, reflect on them, because the pathways approach isn't a big capital letters thing. It's very much a work in progress. But it starts, I think, with some of the core contradictions that we see in and around debates about sustainability and innovation and development more broadly. Because there seems to be very often a fundamental mismatch between an understanding of uncertainty and complexity, at the heart of the STEPS approach, and the attempts to create stability and control through a techno-managerial mainstream approach. Now, of course, this phenomenon has been exposed and debated many times by James Scott in Seeing Like a State, by Tanya Lee in The Will to Improve, by Tim Mitchell in Rule by Experts, and indeed many others. But what I think the STEPS perspectives does is help us expand this discussion and link it much more concretely to sustainability debates, challenging in the process many of our conventional models of and notions of progress and modernity, and therefore mainstream approaches to sustainability and development in a quite challenging way, as I hope we will, as I hope you will see. So how do we think about our core concept, sustainability? Now, it's a tricky term, much debated and contested, and it has a long history going way back to commercial foresters in the 18th century when they were thinking about sustainable growth of forests. But the contemporary debate, I think, can be located in the birth of environmentalism in the 60s and 70s. Silent Spring, Limits to Growth, Only One Earth, Blueprint for a Small Planet. All of these were important contributions in the 60s and 70s to a growing environmental movement that offered at one time both apocalyptical visions of a silent spring, but also the beginnings of utopian solutions, even if in the form of blueprints. This moved, I think, through into the 1980s with the emergence of the idea of sustainable development. Of course, most famously put together in Our Common Future by Brundtland and the Commission on Environment Development, which then was subsequently presented at the Rio Conference in 1992. And Brundtland defined sustainable development in the following way. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So a very explicit cross-generational commitment to livelihoods. And of course, since the Rio Summit and the rise of sustainable development as an idea, the ideas of sustainability and development being connected have become very much mainstream, and some would say, including myself, rather managerial and technocratic in their formulation. There are dozens of planning approaches and frameworks and measurement indicators and audit systems and evaluation protocols that create a managerialism and a bureaucratization around the earlier, much more radical ideas of sustainability and development. Moving forward to the SDGs launched in 2015 and providing a platform for this debate until 2030. And the STEP Centre, since we've been around, has been trying to, as it were, capture some of the more radical and recapture some of the more radical perspectives and challenge some of the more managerial, technocratic perspectives on sustainability, while still retaining the idea that sustainability is a useful concept around which we can have a productive and political debate about the future of the world. And I think the SDGs, many people have criticized them, but I think some of us actually have a relatively more positive view about the potential of the SDGs as a platform for thinking across a whole variety of different themes that all contribute to questions of sustainability. Very often kept separately, and sometimes in the implementation and thinking about the SDGs, each of the goals is separated off. But thinking about them together, we can think about a politics of transformation and sustainability that cuts across. So the wider rhetorical arguments within the SDGs about leaving no one behind and thinking across the 17 goals is an attempt, I think, to bring issues of justice and inequality to sustainability concerns, a clear normative stance in the tradition of Brundtland, linking social, environmental, and economic values. And what is sustainability, of course, is always negotiated in context. So a plan for the SDGs in one country will look different from another, or one region from another. It's always political. It's always thinking across goals, across the multiple targets, always framed by different interests and different knowledges. And this is what is at the center of a pathways approach. So let's think about framing and narratives, a central perspective of the pathways approach, because pathways are framed by different narratives. So I'm going to draw on some of my work from Zimbabwe and offer, as it were, three visions of agriculture in Zimbabwe in the period after land reform. So first, there's this vision, a vision of smallholder agriculture, driving poverty reduction, protecting livelihoods and supporting many. It's the basis of a low input, low pollution system, but largely dependent on dryland farming and so vulnerable to climate change. It offers accumulation possibilities for some, basic livelihoods for many, yet is often set within a patriarchal setting. Here's another framing of small-scale agriculture post-land reform, a vision of medium-scale commercial farming linked to markets, upgrading technically and economically, such as in this case linking to horticultural markets, selling to supermarkets, traders, earning income to pay labor, invest in the farm, generating growth and employment in a local economy. And here's a third vision of agriculture post-land reform, a vision of large-scale commercial estate agriculture, here sugar estates linked to industrial mills and export markets, potential for export, for tax revenue, foreign exchange earning, and creating jobs, with employees supported by health and education facilities on the estates, perhaps linking to biofuel production and alternative energy sources. But downsides with high water requirements, long value chains, and negative effects of sugar consumption and indeed sugar production. So which one of these three visions, or which combination, makes for sustainable development? It's not obvious. The answer is not obvious. In the descriptions of the three photos that I've just presented, I've mentioned 14 of the 17 goals. but in different contexts, emphasized in different visions in different ways. The bottom line is that sustainable development, whether in agriculture in Zimbabwe or wherever, is not just a technical debate about economics and the environment, efficiency. It's a political one too. And it's about the directions for development, about justice, about recognition, about distribution, and a broader idea of sustainability. And that's what we're trying to get across with the Pathways approach. Now, how to think about all of this in a more integrated way. This diagram is one of the ones that we started off with in thinking about the Pathways approach. And I think it's still useful in many respects. It starts with the idea of a system, a complex interaction of elements, an underdetermined reality, as you can see on the right. Lots of elements there. For any system, for example, food and agriculture in Zimbabwe, we're concerned with how plural framings of the world, as in my last slides, create diverse pictures of this underdetermined complex reality. So the framings may come from different sources, from academics, from government, from business, all of which have contending knowledges and values at their heart. Now, pathways emerge linked to narratives about these relationships. Pathways are co-constituted social, technical, environmental, economic processes of change, cutting through this. There are dominant pathways pushed by powerful interests, and there are alternative pathways promoted and practiced by those who are less powerful. So if we're to think about what's sustainable, we have to think about different framings and how people see the world, different people see the world. So in respect of Zimbabwe, sure, it's certainly a complex reality. The system has diverse pictures, plural frames, no question. And as we've seen, there are very different framings. Support for poor people's livelihood versus local markets and economic development versus export agriculture and foreign exchange earning. And there's an important politics of knowledge at play in all this. What is farming? Who are the farmers? What is a successful, viable farm? And so on. Many questions are opened up by this interrogation. And so it leads us to a politics of interest between different types of farmers, the state, donors, corporate agriculture, media, and so on. Different framings are associated with different narratives linked to interests and actor networks, which then in turn constitute these pathways. So negotiations between pathways are always political, a dialectical negotiation between competing, diverse, contending knowledges that suggest options for the future and the political, economic processes that shore up particular incumbent power and shape and direct pathways. So pathways emerge through this interaction. It requires both, in our methodologies, an analysis of diverse contexts and knowledges, the complex system realities, what Karl Marx in the introduction to the Grundrisse so called the multiple determinations and relations, or what others call livelihoods and ecosystem complexity, and the structural dimensions of political economy, what Marx called the concrete. And it's the relationships between these dimensions that create pathways: dominant, alternative, subaltern, imagined. Let's think about this in relation to some of the STEP Centre's early work in Kenya. Kenya is highly reliant on maize for food security. Different regions with different levels of food insecurity can be found, depending on agroclimatic conditions. And these are shifting because of climate change. So depending on how you frame the problem, there are different responses to the challenges of food insecurity. So one would be to say, let's work with some indigenous varieties of maize, or at least locally generated varieties of maize that can increase resilience. Others say, let's focus on hybrids and this makes sense to boost yield and allow more focused production with irrigation and increased management. And others say, Let's use the best of modern science, genetic engineering, and enhance drought resistance and produce the ideal variety for changing environments in Kenya. All of these are different pathways, and it depends on how you understand the problem, the effects of climate on cropping, the value of yield growth versus stability, the perspectives of risks to genetic resources from GM, dietary preferences, labor relations, health impacts. I could go on. And what the work in Kenya did was identified a whole range of different maize pathways, as I've just discussed. And there are others if we take in a broader view of the system, if we're concerned with livelihoods, not just individual crops. And we can then ask bigger questions about which crops articulate best with changing opportunities for off-farm income, for example, with changing gender roles on farm linked to male migration. Are there other labor-saving options that would suggest a different crop combination? And despite the dominance of maize today, are there other crops like small grains that might be more resilient to changing climates and fit with changing market and dietary demands? Each pathway, and I could go on with those questions, reflects a particular narrative relayed by different people and has different social, technological, economic, and environmental implications, and so different versions of what sustainability is. And these issues have to be thought about together. So to recap, pathways. For any issue, we might therefore identify an array of narratives. So think of any issue that you're working on and think of the array of narratives, different stories about the nature of a problem and the potential solution. And we ask, who are the actors and networks articulating that narrative? What's the specific framing of the system and its dynamics, including the treatment of different notions of bounding, spatial and temporal scale, goals and values prioritized for system change? And which dynamic properties of sustainability are prioritized? In particular, to what extent is the narrative focused on shocks or stresses, control, or response? Thinking about pathways to sustainability pushes also to think about change, about transformation. How does change happen? The second major book that came out of the STEP Centre in 2015 was called The Politics of Green Transformation, involved a collaborative contribution from across the centre. And it highlighted a few big issues. In the context of powerful and incumbent unsustainable systems, how do we achieve transformation to new pathways? For example, if we're locked into a high carbon, fossil fuel dependent energy system, how do we create new alternatives? How do we transform to a low carbon future? Does this happen through technology and innovation, through markets, through state interventions, or through citizen action and mobilization, or combinations and alliances between these? And beyond the regular, incremental, managed transitions within systems, are there opportunities for wider transformations that are more disruptive and unruly, that transform rather than just change at the margins? These are the sort of questions that we asked in that book and has driven the debate in the STEP Centre over recent years in thinking about not only how we understand sustainability and pathways, but how do we change pathways in order to create new forms of sustainable development. A lot of that work in recent years has evolved under the STEPS Pathways Network through the interactions with the STEPS global hubs in Argentina, in China, in India, in Kenya, in Mexico, in the US, and in the UK and Sweden. And these pictures on the slide are examples of where the teams were elaborating what were called transformation labs, bringing local people, policymakers, business people, researchers, and others together in a transdisciplinary dialogue about pathways to sustainability and thinking about the possibilities for transformation. Now, I don't have time to go into all the cases, but each aim to develop solutions to locally define sustainability challenges, framed in the way that made sense locally. And these were around food and agriculture, around low carbon energy, around water resources, and more. The process of building opportunities for transformation was at one time collective, involving groups of people, participatory, involving them, and political, inevitably opening up plural pathways for transformatory change. And in thinking through all of those experiences over the last years, we reflected on what is meant by transformations. Transformations, rather like sustainability, has become imbued with all sorts of meanings, and very often in the process losing its political edge and analytical edge. And one of the roles of the STEP Centre is to re-inject that through the experiences that we've had. And we identified three processes, which may happen separately, may happen in sequence, or may happen all together. Transformations involve structural shifts, necessarily, the political economy dimensions, deep, radical transformations in incumbent power, major changes in the way political and economic processes work. They may involve systemic changes, more instrumental shifts in policies, in regulations, in incentives, in bureaucratic procedures, still necessary and very often only incremental, but still part and parcel of transformation. And transformations very often are linked to and forced through and encouraged and indeed prefigured by more enabling change from the bottom up. Sometimes it's unruly, it's uncertain, it's unpredictable. It evolves through coalitions and alliances. It's embedded in new practices in particular places, testing out what a sustainable alternative might be. All of these are political economy, the politics of policy, and the politics of movements and activism. But they're all needed for transformations. And when we look at different examples of transformations in the past or in the present, we see that all of these are implicated. So let me just give a quick example. Together with the STEPS America Latina group, farmers in Argentina identified the issue of corporate control of seeds and the limited choice and high expense of seeds for poorer farmers as a big sustainability challenge for them in the agri-food system. And the Senate team, involving Annabelle Marin, who you can see, and many others, work with farmers, seed producers, regulators, policymakers to come up with a new, practical, transformative innovation that would shift this challenge. It was an open source material transfer agreement for seeds. Sounds quite bureaucratic and simple, not, because it's embedded in a wider collaborative process of change, opening up a very different set of thinking about a collaborative economy in agriculture, challenging conventional ideas of property and knowledge relations embedded in corporate agriculture. It was launched in organizational form by BioLeft, and a variety of different processes have unfolded since. All of these have been combining the three elements of transformation I mentioned before. There have been systemic instrumental shifts in policy and legal frameworks and the nature of the seed contract. There have been enabling processes led by social movements and mobilized to push for this. And there has, as a result, been structural shifts, wider challenges to the power of monopolistic capitalist seed firms wedded to a very particular restrictive intellectual property regime. So all dimensions of transformation combine together around a particular sustainability challenge. You can think of your own examples and think about which elements of the transformatory processes are necessary. It's not just going to happen through a transition which emerges simply from policy change, although that may be necessary. So, what were the principles of transformation that emerged from all of these experiences? We've written this up in a variety of ways, and it has implications for thinking about methodologies. And I mentioned the T-Labs before. 3 themes come out, and these are central to thinking about the pathways approach more broadly and thinking about transformations. Diverse knowledges are important: expert, lay, formal, tacit, local, global, all given weight in the joint framings of problems and solutions. In thinking about transformation, there can be no hierarchy of expertise and an acceptance of the value of hybrid knowledges. In other words, a transdisciplinary approach is essential. And this generates the idea of plural pathways, an acceptance that there's no one solution. There isn't a singular version of sustainability. There are multiple pathways, depending on who you are, where you live, what your priorities are. And of course, politics are central. Transformations require challenging incumbent power, as we said before. In the terms of Mike Watts and Nancy Peluso, challenging regimes of truth, of rule, and of accumulation all together. And all of these principles challenge, we argue, the mainstream way of thinking about and implementing sustainability that has become the dominant version, the dominant techno-managerial version of sustainable development today. But these ideas, we submit, can change that and provide a more emancipatory and politically informed alternative. So what does all of this mean to a wider politics of transformation? I've given a positive, idealistic, enthusiastic view, which we all share within the STEP Centre, but we've also got to be realistic. Let's face it, when we're thinking about a new politics of transformation, the challenges of bringing together structural, systemic, and enabling approaches all together are very real. And our Pathways sustainability teams found that definitely in all the settings that they worked. What's more, given the shrinking civic space and the rise of a particularly regressive, authoritarian version of populist politics, the opening for more progressive forms of sustainability seem to be shrinking before our eyes and are especially challenging today. But linking the Pathways approach to a wider debate about the politics of transformation and following the work of Chantal Mouffe and others, we can see perhaps in this context of forms of authoritarian populism, the potential for new alliances of the people, redefined, rooted in social action, across issues and effective identities. What Chantal Mouffe calls a progressive left populism rooted in radical democracy. Seeing the people as in opposition to oligarchic capital, exclusionary racism, environmental destruction, we can envision, in her terms, an agonistic struggle between different pathways to sustainability. And it's in this context that we see sustainable development emerging in a more and slightly different way to perhaps it's more conventionally framed. Now, this does necessarily need to address wider issues of structural and political, economic and incumbent power that we've talked about, as well as involve new policy frameworks, as well as engaging with and mobilizing and prefiguring alternatives as part of a wider struggle. Pathways to Sustainability is fundamentally about the politics of struggle and democratic struggle, often against very powerful forces. So where do we see examples of new politics of transformation? Well, this slide has pictures of the student climate strikes, Extinction Rebellion, but we've also had Black Lives Matter and other mobilizations all over the world across a range of issues that connect issues around biodiversity, about food, about lifestyles, and a new style of politics that takes race, gender, environment, social difference together and seriously. So this new, perhaps unruly movement politics, often linked to very practical experiments on the ground, can potentially help drive transformative change, despite the strictures of and dominance of a particular form of neoliberal capitalism that dominates the global economy, and the rise of authoritarian populism in different parts of the world. And we would argue that potentially this offers some hope around creating new forms of sustainability and sustainable development. But that's a debate, and that's a debate that we'll have throughout this course in ways that I'm sure different examples can be brought to bear. So what does this mean more broadly, going back to the more conceptual questions about how we understand pathways to sustainability? How should we frame a transformative approach to creating new pathways to sustainability? Now, this slide, in obviously binary terms, in rather simplistically and in many ways, contrasts what have been called controlling transitions and caring transformations. So on the left side, you'll see many of the frequently articulated critiques of mainstream development and innovation studies and sustainable development that I've been talking about during this session. On the right, you can see a range of concepts that are central to the core ideas of the STEPS pathways approach, which I've also been talking about. Now, presented starkly like this, they suggest actually very different ways between transitions and transformations of thinking about action around sustainability. So following our STEPS experience, I think it means starting with the local, focusing on connected issues that people care about, building alliances for change that link people and places to issues and institutions in new ways, based on local practical knowledge and agency. That's what the Pathways Network work has been trying to do. And it means linking together new networks and movements. It's often messy, it's often unruly, pathways emerge in different ways, but it's not a naive localism. It's one that challenges mainstream techno-managerial approaches and controlling transitions. And politically, this means, following Nancy Fraser, for example, connecting a politics of redistribution and issues of class and social difference with a politics of recognition and questions of identity and identification, with a politics of representation and questions of community, belonging, and citizenship. All of these politics have to be center stage in debates about sustainability, we argue. And so it means avoiding a simplistic, top-down, linear approach of managed transitions, of grand challenges, of emergency responses, of eco-modernist technological solutions with cockpit visions of global control, and with that modernizing notions of progress and development, even if couched in nicely sounding progressive language around sustainable development. More practically, what does this mean for how interventions are conceived of and sustainability enacted? Here we contrast constructions of the nature of the challenge between stresses and shocks, and the view of this challenge, and the style of action between control and care, which I've introduced just now. We can see really quite different approaches, whether that's decarbonisation, urbanisation, commodification, disease emergence, which are the examples here. For example, for responding to climate change, quite different responses exist between geoengineering solutions, control-orientated to a single shock, responding to a boundary or a limit, to more open-ended grassroots innovations and social changes emerging to responding to emerging stress in an unfolding change. So thinking about styles of action and the views and framing of those actions provides us a way into thinking about sustainability in a more nuanced way, and perhaps challenges us to think about alternative pathways in ways that that challenge the dominant perspectives. Now, before concluding, I want to just turn to a final set of comments about what all this means for our role as researchers, as practitioners, as people engaged in debates about sustainability, and ask questions about what kinds of knowledge making are important and who are they for. Because we're all involved in creating knowledges, but how do we intervene in debates about sustainability? How should environmental social science, for example, that many of us come from with different disciplinary orientations, situate ourselves amongst wider practices of knowledge making and communication? So, as researchers engaged in debates about sustainability, where are we? Where do we sit in this space that I've identified here? What is the relationship between different types of knowledge production, between different researchers, practitioners, advisors, activists, identities, some of which we hold at different times or at the same time in our careers? This diagram is a simple one originally from Michael Burroway, which contrasts two forms of instrumental knowledge focused on two forms of knowledge focused on different audiences. So for instrumental knowledge, we have professionalized knowledge making, academic work for scholarly audiences, the conventional, detached, if you like, academic research. We have policy knowledge making, solving problems for policymakers or practitioners or groups of activists, more associated with consulting or advisory work. And we have two types of reflexive knowledge, again linked to different audiences. The idea of critical knowledge making, engaging critically with the foundations and directions of academic research, and public knowledge making, which articulates with a wider public sphere. So STEP's work and a new science of sustainability, or a new environmental social science, if you like, I suggest needs to compass all four elements and move nimbly amongst them. It may be different people, it may be different times, it may be in different parts of an organization. And over the years, I think STEP's center work has tried to do all of this, juggling between the requirements of academic knowledge production to get out there in accredited, peer-reviewed journals, with engaging more directly in an impact agenda around policy or around engaging with publics through social movements, as well as providing a sort of more critical reflection. And during this course, we will have plenty of opportunities to think about how we position ourselves and think about normative and political agendas around sustainability and our scholarly and activist and policy orientated selves that come together at different points. And thinking about how a pathways approach allows us to combine elements of that in interesting and different ways. And this has been very much part of the philosophy of the STEP Centre over the 15 years of its existence. As I mentioned before, we have a number of hubs who work together with us, located in different parts of the world. And a lot of the collaborations and learning and challenging across those four quadrants that I've just mentioned has been going on in and between the different hubs, north and south. And many of the alumni who we work with and have been part of the summer schools over the years have come from and engaged with this debate along the way. And this course is very much an invitation for you to join the debate, to think with us, challenge us, to come up with new ways of thinking, but more particularly think through towards action and political engagement, what it means to think about pathways to sustainability. And I'm going to conclude there with a word cloud of some of the terms and words that come up in a variety of our different papers combined in this one diagram. Thank you very much.